minutes, mais tu dois avoir un compte spécial pour monter.
Non, t'es pas limité à 10 minutes.
Sylvain, est-ce que ça te dérange de faire un petit essai de micro, s'il te plaît?
The first test for the mic, Mr. Lawrence on the mic.
Ça passe?
Ça, j'y crois pas trop à ce truc en fait.
Toi, tu n'y crois pas trop?
Non.
Ben, après, quand t'es là,
Sinon, moi je les change, hein, c'est pas grave. Tu me dis, tu me fais un signe. Tu me fais un signe et je les change. Si je mets next, tu me dis next et hop.
ouais. On fait un essai au début, ça marche pas, c'est toi qui ça t'arrange pas.
D'accord. Pas de problème.
Si
C'est là
ça
pour
marche,
ça.
on continue. Puis...
Ah. Bon. Alors voilà.
Non, déjà, tu vois, ils sont beaucoup plus fluides. Hein. Puis,
Je crois que c'est mon CPU qui suit pas.
c'est Windows qui demande à ton CPU de bosser 50
J'ai plein
fois
de
plus
gens qui me disent que le stream n'a pas marché.
Ouais.
Et ça partirait, il marche.
Bah, maintenant,
Mais là, on a mis
maintenant,
sa
ça
machine, ouais.
Non, je peux. Non,
Ouais.
Quoi?
ça repartait.
On prend le son de la caméra. Donc.
Donc,
Un café, Martin?
Non, mais je vais prendre quelque chose.
Very good, Martin. Very good talks. Very interesting, yeah. My comment about...
This is live. That's live.
No, but I don't want to go live.
Okay, well, that's
Uncomfortable.
subject is subject. Emotion is subject. So anything
I left the church before
you actually physically festival world. Oh my goodness.
I like
So it's interesting to we did this, I think it was the summer school.
yeah, but I was
It was great. It's a
very well.
no, it wasn't very new. We managed to get
I only I chose so Yeah, we can do
Yeah, so my job is to try to change.
Well, I too many years at the JRC, I learned that it was always they didn't realize that they were and that's what they share. They don't have, they are not aware about
There we still have progress. You have between.
J'ai testé le streaming, voir en haut avec mes collègues si ça va bien. Je sais pas si elle me. Voilà, je fais un test. Coucou. Hello.
Si elles m'ont vu, ça marche.
Hello everyone, can you please come back to the room? We're going to start again. Thanks.
Hello everyone, thanks for getting back to the room. We're going to start again. And we're going to continue our discussion with a presentation, the longest actually of them all because it's a special issue, by Sylvain Laurence. Sylvain, I'm particularly happy to introduce you to today's audience because, well, you're a political sociologist from the High School for Social Sciences in Paris, but it happens that 2 weeks ago you, at last, I would say, published a book on which you've been working for several years called, in French, Les courtiers du capitalisme, milieu d'affaires et bureaucrates à Bruxelles, in quick translation, Capitalism Brokers, Business Circles and Bureaucrats in Brussels. This book is the outcome of more than 3 years of field research here in Brussels, among trade associations, consultancies, multinational companies. You've come out of this journey with, I find, really fascinating insights on how the lobbying industry in Brussels was created and structured, how it evolved over time, and a very clear picture of the quasi-symbiotic relationship that exists between the European Commission and the lobby groups that surround it. To the point that you use the word quasi-auxiliary bureaucracy to describe them. Actually, you're not the only one to use that term. But I'm not going to spoil your book anymore, and I will just let people know that you will be presenting and signing your book next Thursday at 6 p.m. in the Librairie Filigrane, Avenue des Arts. Sylvain, the floor is yours, and please try to not go beyond 25 minutes if you can.
Okay, thank you very much, Martin. So first of all, I would like to thank Corporate Europe Observatory and all the NGOs here for setting up this conference. It's very important for social scientists to have the opportunity to discuss their works with a broader audience than only academics. And as it has been said, all the statistics or data I will use today are from my latest book, which was recently published, unfortunately in French. Maybe translation will soon be available, but all the archives or all the statistics I'm using here are from a fieldwork who has started in 2009, and so it's the book is a digest of all the results of a fieldwork with different components. So I will cite archives from European institutions, interviews with lobbyists and high-ranking civil servants from the EU institutions, from different DGs. And I will also give some clues about the degree of scientificity of the internal meetings of business associations. So there will be 5 steps, 5 points in my talk today. First, we will talk about history briefly. I would like to underline that things we are talking about today are not or completely new. Then I will point out what has changed since the 90s. Thirdly, I will present all the new forms of lobbying to be more and more scientific. And then I will show what is at stake for business in this new field of science. My conclusion will briefly deal with the consequences of all this for democracy. So first step, some words about, let's talk briefly about history. So the beginning of the EU institutions, so the relationships between EU institutions, business and science relate to the history of the EU Commission as a bureaucracy. If you open the archives of the European administration, you can only be struck by the weakness of this bureaucracy at its very beginning. Sorry. So, with the beginning of the EU institutions begins the history of an administration that has to build its legitimacy against the administration of national member states. It could sound weird because member states are part of the EU. But here is an excerpt from an interview of a civil servant at the DG Internal Market in the 60s. And if you read it, you will see that this new bureaucracy had at its very beginning to build its legitimacy, its own expertise. By then, national member states believe that the economy is a monopoly of the national administration. And so I don't have to elaborate on this early phase, but what is very interesting in these first moments is that the European Commission wanted business interest group to be seated in Brussels, and sometimes they paid for that happened. So it's something that we have to keep in mind. So if lobbying today is strong, it's because there is a bureaucracy that at the very beginning organized the arrival of lobbying here. So, faced with member states, the choice of Commission officials was to produce European data, asking the business community to collect it. But this emergence of a European economic expertise was not so easy. So, if you want, I can give you a clue of what you found in the archives of the EU in the 60s. The main issue are what is the EU's iron production per year? What is the EU's car production per year? How can our administration deal with the United States during the GATT negotiation if we don't have any aggregated data for the entire EU? So here, if you're looking in the European Commission archives, what is very clear, so that is very clear is that if you are reading the notes and the comments of civil servants at that time, so they are considering that experts in national business associations have low skill or are caught in national ways of thinking, and they try to intensify contact with business associations to fill some gaps, to find statistics built at the European level. So if you are just trying to have data from France and you ask for national administration, you will not always find the data. But if you call for Italian administration, it's the same problem. So the business organized on an EU basis would provide the expertise and the synthesis of their position. And this is what is really at stake in the 60s. So if you are considering the EU civil servant strategy at the very beginning of the Commission, they collect contacts of trade associations that agree to help the decision process. They built directories. So we talk about the transparency register, but the first directory for European Commission, it is in 1961. And here it is a copy of this register. In this first register of interest group, you will find a lot of contacts, of name, of people from different national administration, and European Commission is asking them to build coalitions and to build a new European business association based on national membership. So, next please. If you're considering in the 60s, 70s and 80s, European business associations are quite a foreign table of national association, and this European Business Association are guaranteeing service servants a synthesis of business positions based on the expertise of different national associations. And they are also giving another guarantee to the civil servant. That is a position given from this European Business Association won't generate a counter lobbying on in national member states. So it's a kind of less common denominator. But if you know that if your next directive will pass through the council if you just follow this kind of synthesis. So what is very important for me is to show that from the very beginning, the European business associations provide a kind of synthesis that is very useful for bureaucrats of European Commission. It's not only about science. I will talk about science and expertise, but it's also a kind of consensus or synthesis produced by business that guarantee to the people inside the desk, officers, each different units, that their position will pass through the council or different steps in the EU system. So if you are just considering how works the European Business Association in the 70s and the 80s, the General Assembly is quite a coalition of national trade associations. So you have European Business Association, for instance, for metals, and there is kind of general assembly with the German Association for Metals, Italian Association for Metals, and so on. And what is very interesting is if you are looking at the relationship between this business association and the European Commission, there are very strong links since the 70s between this association, sometimes that have been paid, funded by European Commission at its very beginning, and desk officers and head of units of European Commission. They are a kind of relationship very close. Why? Because if you are considering what is at stake in member states, you can find national trade association, but the president is living here in the capital, and he can meet sometimes the minister or so on. But in the case of Brussels, the president of European associations are not every day on Brussels. They only come maybe twice or 3 times a year. And all the time, it is the director of the association or the staff of the association that is directly connected and in interaction with people from the European Commission. The system was adapted to the evolution of EU institution. If you're just considering, so you take this is, I have to explain this maybe. So if you are just considering here, so it is a directory from 1960 of the European Commission, the list of all business associations. Here is a directory of 1973 and so on. And then you have the number of members, or many national associations are part of this European association. So you can see that at its very beginning, this association was adapted to the evolution of the EU, because when there is an enlargement, the new member state is represented through this coalition of national members. So maybe, yes. So maybe next slide, please. So now I would like to say that this whole model of relationships between the EU Commission and business association has been impacted by at least 3 changes. And these 3 changes, next slide please, have made lobbying increasingly science-based, because business interest groups are trying to maintain this historical privileged access to bureaucracy, to EU institutions. So what has changed since the 90s? So the first change is the new density of the European Charter. So business is no longer alone. Here it is a map of the European Charter in 1973. Buildings in grey are European Commission buildings, and each dot is an interest group. And if the dot is very big, it means that there are 10 interest groups in the same building. So now we can see the same charter in 1991. And then we can see the same map in 2009, please. Yeah. So of course there are more buildings of European Commission, but it's not the main results of this map. The map is showing that there are more and more business interest groups here. It is a map for the region of Brussels. So there are a lot of interest groups also outside the European Charter, of course. But what is very interesting too is that this map also shows that there are 230 NGOs in the same charter, and all of the NGOs seated in Brussels today arrived in the second half of the 90s. So this is the first change. So the density of the European Charter is not the same. We could also talk about consultancies, think tanks, and so on, but these old business associations are no more in a kind of permanent dialogue with European Commission without in-house around. Then next slide, next. Okay. So second change we could mention there, it's the rise of bureaucracy before and after the legislative process. Some MEPs or some journalists used to say that European Parliament has got more and more power, but we have to consider 3 things. First thing, that's the complexity of the logic of the informal trilogue. So you can say that there is co-decision, there is a new system of decision which gives a lot of place, a lot of influence to European Parliament. But if you are just considering how things works, so when the new derivative or the new regulation is in the informal trilogue, then it's again the role of the European Commission is very important, and all lobbyists that I met always underline that point, that their desk officer is also very powerful in this kind of in this sequence of decision. The second point is the rise of comitology. We have a lot of text. We have 3,000 texts every year that are updated in comitology. They are no more passing through the European Parliament. So you can say that more power is given to European Parliament, but a lot of texts are no more discussed in the Parliament. And then there is a third point I mentioned in my book is the rise of new agencies, where here there's a kind of new mojo. It's when we have a problem, you build a regulation, a directive, and this directive gives new powers to a new agency. And it's maybe for me the best case studies of this way of thinking is directive REACH. You have a problem to solve, that all dangerous products from chemical companies have to be registered, so you create a new agency, you put it in Finland, and then you have a kind of technical arenas that is created in order to solve a problem. So these two changes are very well known, so I pass on it very quickly. But I would like to underline a third change since the 90s. This is that European business associations are no longer a simple coalition of national trade associations. They are directly driven by European champions or multinational firms. This is one of the side effects of the construction of a common market. National champions became European champions or multinational firms. Here there are data from the works of the frame. Here, if you are just considering the seat, where is the seat of the 500 major firms, considering Fortune, and so you can see that there is a moment in the 80s where European firms began to reappear in this rank. So here it's USA, here it's EU, here it's UK, USA. UK, sorry, and EU, USA, UK, EU, and you see there since the beginning of the 2000s there are more and more firms from the EU that reintegrate the ranking of Fortune because of the mergers. So you have a lot of national champions that are buying over national champions, and you have more and more biggest firms on the European continent. And today, if we are just counting how firms are represented in Brussels directly, that means that they have their own office in Brussels, or indirectly, that means that they are funding a business association or a think tank or a foundation. With the data I gave in the book, we can consider that maybe less than a half of the biggest firms of the world are represented every day in Brussels. 2/3 of European Business Association accept direct memberships from major firms. So this is a big change, because before that you have a coalition of national trade associations producing a synthesis and expertise in order to give a kind of clue of how the business in Europe will consider this directive. Today you have business association directly driven by major firms, and the expertise given by this business association now are directly connected to this old historical relation I showed previously, are not directly connected to desk officers and people from different units. And these firms have enough resources to fund scientific forms of expertise. Because if you are just, or maybe it's not useful, but it's just to show that there is no more this kind of general assembly composed from national associations. The membership now is directly composed of major firms of the sectors. But what is very funny, where that these major firms of the sectors in a lot of business associations are no more from Europe no more. If you are looking at the confederation of the the machines for building. You will find Caterpillar, which is a Canadian firm. We'll find Hitachi, which is a Japanese firm. But these firms are one of the biggest members of this European Confederation. So what we are calling European Confederation today, most of the time, are just a coalition of the biggest firms of the economical sectors. So all the relationship with European Commission now is changed, because head of unit or desk officers of the different DGs are directly connected to business association, but where the thematic committees is now fueling the head of the unit of the desk officer with the expertise of the major firms of the world on the sector. It's quite a difference. It's no more, you are not trying to build a dialogue with people giving to you a kind of miniature of what could the council look for your directive. Now the business association is giving to you directly an expertise based on engineers and people from the major firms of the sectors. So these three changes are making the hypothesis in the book that this produce a new form of new lobbying strategies. So the first strategy is easy to sum up. So in order to avoid NGOs and a lot of cause lawyers that are present in the European Parliament, most of the lobbyists today are trying to focus on Commission. And the idea is that MEPs are changing, but bureaucrats last for long. So we could quote here one of the manager of the European Business Association called Galim, and he's explaining very well that since he's here since the 70s, so in the 70s the guy who are talking was maybe desk officer, but today the same guy could be a director general. You can also find this kind of, and it's not only about corruption, it's also about getting old in a place where no decisions are taken. It's very important to have this in mind. The second strategy we could sum up is know your desk officer. So this is an extract from an internal document of the CEOwebtv, which is the Confederation for Certification and Business. And here you will see that there is a kind of a portrait of an high-ranking civil servant of a DG. What is very interesting here is that they are not focusing on an MEP, they are focusing on someone who is not known at all from the public. They are talking about this guy, Mr. McBennett, who has been invited to the General Assembly of the Confederation, and they are expecting to keep good relation with this guy. But this guy that is presented to their members in their newsletter. This is not MEPs. And it's something very important to have in mind. And this is something that you can also find in a lot of training given to people in public affairs or lobbying. Here it is a slide from a training of MCAMEU, the American Chamber of Commerce. And you will see there that one of the first advice that is given to the next guy in public affairs is to consider the big difference between USA and European system. In European system, you won't find no PACs. So that means that you cannot give directly money for the re-election of an MEP. And it's a big difference for lobbyists, because you can find corruption in Brussels, but you cannot be sure that the money you give to a deputy will be used for his next campaign, because the MEP will be re-elected if his national party will give it the mandate to be the next candidate. So this, you cannot connect politics, lobbying and money in the same way that you can do in the US. So this is the second thing that explains why in Brussels we find the predominance of quiet politics. It is a notion invented by a political scientist called Cooper, and he's explaining that very kind of politics that we all know in general in election and this kind of political life, but there is also a kind of politics that is producing no sound, because it's a politics only with bureaucrats. So lobbyists talking with bureaucrats, or business talking with bureaucrats. And in Brussels, this quiet politics, we could say that quiet politics in Brussels requires science. Here it's another quotation from a senior advisor from Eurogas, and she's explaining to me that she spent maybe 80% of the time with people from the European Commission. And this kind of dialogue today requires to give numbers, to give data, arguments to the desk officer in order to influence the decision process. So it's not only, can you say, she's giving it in the conclusion, so we will argue and say that we cannot see where come from these numbers they quote, and they are trying to give new numbers. So this means that you have to keep in your business association enough expertise in order to produce a lobbying truth science, and this is maybe one of the biggest change of the last years. Now, today, lobbies want to seem more and more like institute or research center, and no more only as the representative of an economical sectors. And it offers a means to access to arenas where NGOs are very few and weak. So some business associations are changing their statutes from ISBL, with the most used statutes, used to be the more used. So it's you know that Belgian law allows people from foreign countries to have their own association with a special statute. It's a very protective statute, but you can also have different statutes in Belgian law that can be used, that make you see more and more than an institute. And a lot of business associations now are today people with PhDs. This is quite become a standard practice in the chemical sector, where toxicologists are very numerous inside business associations. Something very that you can just measure if you're just looking at who is being recruited, but you can also figure it if you are just looking on the website where of the business association where you will find the job, announcement with looking for toxicology. So here is another quotation, this time from someone from Eurochlor, which is of course the European Association defending chlorine-based products industry. And then you will find that he's explaining in a book from Justin Greenwood how Eurochlor changed its staff in the 90s. And so before the 90s, they only had 2 part-time staff, and since the 90s now there are 14 full-time employees with 5 employees with PhD in toxicology. So this is a big change of the background of the people who are now lobbyists. So if you have in mind lobbyist as someone with a background in political science or economical science, this could be true in some sectors, still be true. But if you just looking at the division of labor inside business association today, they want to have direct dialogue with desk officers or with new agencies. So they are just hiring people with a toxicologist background or background in science that is adapted to their needs. So if you look today at what looks like opposition paper from Eurochlor, please, next slide. So it's no more a position paper. This is a kind of scientific article. So we found a bibliography, a state of art, what we know today about chlor and azu, for example, and we found that it's very difficult for NGOs to counter this kind of advocacy, because it's no more advocacy only with words. It's of course science-based cause lowering. But what is very surprising, so few associations allow to me to observe their internal meetings. So you will find this same level of scientificity inside the business association. Here you will find 2 slides from presentation in European Association defending the industry of metals. And it was a committee working on the REACH issue. When the European Chemical Agency has been created, all business have to register their products to the European Chemical Agency. So these slides are from a meeting where we were 14 participants, and 12 of them had a PhD in toxicology. So all of them were able to deal with scientific articles, and all of them are trying to find arguments in order to find a new way to calculate the DNA, thank you. And so the people from different metals were able to find arguments in order to criticize the guidelines given by ICA. So there you have a shift in the lobbying for business interests. It's no more trying to build only a dialogue, providing a synthesis of the different member states, saying that people producing metal from Italy want that, and people from Germany want that, so we could have this kind of synthesis. No, it's no more about that. It's about how we could give scientific arguments to people from European Chemical Agency in order to find reasonable dinners. And it was very happy to see that the word reasonable just pop up on the last intervention, because it is actually the word they use. How we could find reasonable dinners. But reasonable means that will help us not to close our plans. Reasonable means we could go on our business, and it is something that can be heard as scientific, considering what we know from the other agencies, from the American agencies, and so on. But so of course, European institutions are aware of this change, partly, I guess. But the only solution European institutions are giving for this kind of problem is to create stakeholder committees. So European Chemical Agency has its own stakeholder committee. Here it is the composition of this committee. It's from the website of European Chemical Agency, so you can find it online. So you will see that this stakeholder committee is composed 70% from industry association. But what is very funny, so if you are looking the little part that is given here for citizens, you will find ECETOC, that is, we could say, the toxicology department of CEFIC. You will find different associations that, personally, I would not put in the box citizen or environmental NGO. And what is very important there, this is not, again, about only corruption. It's about how you build a system where there is no balance of power, because people from European Chemical Agency would say that they pay you the travel to Finland in order to participate to this stakeholders committee if you want. They pay that trip, but who has the expertise? What kind of NGO could provide daily based expertise on toxicology issues, and who could just have this kind of dialogue with people who are creating the expertise that I showed before. So maybe this is the first point. Science today is useful because it allows to have a kind of quiet politics for lobbying. And if you I got some time in order to, yeah. So, and there is another logic that explains that science is so important today for lobbyists, is that science allows you to win the battles on norms, labeling, and PPPs. And it is maybe as important as the things we said before.
Sorry, Sylvain, can you define PPPs?
Yeah, public-private partnership. So I've already said that we have 314 of the 700 the biggest firms in the world that are represented directly or indirectly in Brussels. If we are considering this one, and we are looking at the list of the 50 firms that who spend the most in lobbying, here we have the list. So here are the 50 biggest firms spending more money in lobbying in Brussels in 2013. So this list is more or less already known. So now we are going to do a little game. So we are going to look the list of the 25 firms who get more money from European Commission, contract and subsidies. So here it is a list. So it's very difficult for you to compare. So I did the work for you. So now the next slide in yellow, the firms that are on the both list. So you understand that what is at stake is not only to to spend money in lobbying in order to have deregulation. You spend money in lobbying because it is investment for your business. You will have subsidies, you will have money back of your expenses in lobbying. And this means that you need to have scientific form of lobbying in order to have this kind of subsidies. You have to suggest to European Commission what will be the next technology in your sector. And so this is also a kind of a shift or a change for business associations. So you are no more suggesting the regulation. You have to suggest a synthesis of what means innovation in your business. And then if you can say to the Commission that you have the 4 or 5 major firms in your sector that agree for this new technology, then maybe European Commission could co-fund it. So this is the sense of this quotation. So this is a guy from the Confederation of European Paper Industry, and he's explaining to me that for in his point of view, the kind of lobbyists are just coming in the office of an MEP with position paper. This is useless today. What is really important for lobbyists is to submit a better standard for its business. And we can follow this example and see that how European Commission today is funding biorefineries. If you are looking on the public-private partnership called BioCore, you will find the confederation who work for this guy. What is at stake here is no more just using money in order to have a better law. It's using money in order to have your next technology funded by public resources. And just go back, please. And in so far the case that it's a kind of also of environmental anti-dumping process, because when you are doing so you have your next technology that is funded by European Commission, but the best thing is that you could build then in the second step an anti-dumping case explaining that paper from China or Asia is not really fair in its production because of environmental issues and this kind of thing. So what is very funny that we can also find a kind of greenwashing that is not only we are using green words in order to appear green. Sometimes if the European Commission gives money, they can really try to be greener than their competitors from Asia. That's something very strange, but it happens more and more. And the next, so in order to sum up, so European Business Association suggests to European Commission that the 4 or 5 major firms in its economical sector would agree on a new norm or new technology or new labeling for medicine, for instance. Is the case for EFPER that we'll see tomorrow. EFPER suggests a new labeling for medicine, and then European Commission agree because it's better for the traceability and so on. And then this new norm of technology or labeling or producing requires funds and expertise. The PPP is built on this ID, and then you will find a lot of PPP in your European system based on this profile. So you will have business association that suggests the norm at the very beginning, European Commission, and universities. So we can give here a few examples of this. For instance, the UNIF is the Railway Joint Association. So they begin with an ISO norm, very specific for the railway and the shift from the rail to the road. And today he produced a PPP called Shift to Rail, that is an unprecedented joint effort by the European rail sector and the European Union to create a step change in rail technology. And then you will find here in the members part of the website the list of all the companies funding UNIF. And we will find also a list of maybe 40 universities and money from European Commission. And we can give this kind of example again and again. Here is the European Green Vehicles Initiative. So you will see there in the organization, internal functioning of these PPP or industry delegates are the equal of European Commission delegates. It's weird, but there is nothing for citizen delegates. So we can try another example. So we can here to add this PPPs, 6 billion of PPPs in research that have been launched in 2013 in December. And in all the board of these PPPs, you will find all these business associations, Ceremony, Eurometo, Semburo, CEFIC. And this is the new form of relationship between this business association with a long history. We begin with that. And today they are just managing this money in PPP. So 2 slides in order to end this presentation. So first, what are the consequences for democracy? So first, if you consider that democracy is the legitimacy from election, what is actually the role of elected people in this system? You won't find any MEPs in any board of these PPPs. You won't find people directly elected, whereas we are talking about a huge amount of money. If you consider that democracy it's not only election, but it's an issue of balance of power. So you have to keep in mind what we said about the stakeholders committee of European Chemical Agency. So it's not enough to say that we have a free door, you can open whenever you want to stakeholders committees. It's no sense, because in some issues we have no citizen's expertise. And if you are considering it is a balance of power, we also have to consider what is the reality of the struggle between the business association today and the NGO. So I took the 2 biggest, I guess, in each side. So if you compare CEFIC with Greenpeace Brussels unit, you will see that it's 1 to 10 for quite each part of the struggle. So the budget is 10 times bigger for CEFIC, number of employees 10 times bigger, and the expertise provided on both sides cannot be compared to. So we have to keep in mind that this system produced an asymmetric form of struggle, and you can consider that we find an expertise from citizens on all the issues that civil servants of European Commission are dealing with every day. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvain. Sorry, en fait, non. Thank you, Sylvain. Lots of questions, I see, so let's start with them. So we have Lisette, Tony, Andrea, and Nicholas to start with. Perhaps if we could take like 4 questions at once, and then you answer them, is that okay?
Yes, just if I found a pen.
Yeah, just hold on a second. Does anybody have a pen and paper? I know it's very primitive technology.
Paper, it's okay, but...
Still nothing beats that.
Thank you. So thanks.
Oh, no, you don't.
So Lisette.
Okay.
No, underneath.
Yeah, okay. Lisette Van Vliet from Health and Environment Alliance. Thank you very much for this. As an ex-social scientist who dropped out of academia to come and work in NGOs, I found that a very interesting presentation. I have a couple of nitpicky points about some of the data that you presented, but perhaps what we should come to is the last one, because that's the big picture, the democracy and the balance of power. I think the general point is right, but if we look specifically at chemicals, yes, there's only one person who works in the Greenpeace unit, but the NGOs in Brussels who work on chemicals all work very closely. So just reducing it to one NGO facing off with CEFIC is not quite accurate. And
10 more.
right, and then there's 10 more big companies outside of CEFIC. But anyway, I think that the more important point here is not the difference in proportion between who can marshal the best scientific lobby, it's still about how the scientific lobby overlaps with the moral and ethical and political questions and how they put the spin on that. And the reason I say this is because we know we are outmanned at any given meeting. You know, it's like trying to work with your arm tied behind your back and you're facing 4 opponents who've got boxing gloves on and you've got nothing but one arm tied behind your back. But we still make a certain amount of progress. And so you can't explain that progress by just looking at 4 people with boxing gloves on versus 1 person with an arm tied behind their back. It's got to do with the science that we lobby on, even though we don't have all the toxicologists, and the political arguments connected to the scientific lobbying that we're doing. I can't really explain it any more generally than that, but that would be my basic comment. But perhaps you and I should talk also bilaterally afterwards. But thank you very much for that. It's very, very interesting.
Thanks, Suzette. Next question, please. Nicolas and then Andrea, and then Tony.
Nicholas Ashford from MIT. Thank you very much for that. 3 questions, really. One is to what extent is the U.S. chemical industry dominating the lobbying efforts on legislation like REACH? Because what we hear is that they've had an enormous and disproportionate size effect on weakening REACH from one version to the other, from the beginning to the end. And so not only have they got their toxicologists, but they've got their strategies set. So that's one question. The second question is, what about a revolving door? To what extent do people within the European Union Commission end up going back into industry and the other way around? Is there any restrictions? Because in the American context, we are beginning to really worry and prohibit this revolving door. And then the third is, environmental NGOs are not the only ones. Kenneth Gilbreth reminds us that unions are necessary as a countervailing force against corporations. This is an old perspective, and of course, many of these chemical issues have to do with occupational exposure, and I know that the unions have a lot of expertise, but is the marriage a good one between the environmental NGOs and the unions? I'm sorry, that's 3 questions.
Yeah, Tony, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Tony Tweedale. I work here in Brussels by myself with toxics NGOs. We've had a lot of history of a lot of issues, and the earliest example I know of a public-private partnership in the area of chemicals is before 1880, with the petrochemical industry just getting started in Europe for the whole world. It was only Germany that, probably at the request of industry, got all the organic chemistries, which was a brand new field of chemistry, to work for industry. I think hundreds of organic chemists and graduate students and PhDs, postdocs. I'd be curious to know of any other really early public-private partnerships. The earlier you get back in time, the more influence they have on what's to be the future. In this case, the real significance of it was that after they went into aniline-based dyes, which was the start of the industry, they had to diversify, and because of all the botanical knowledge that existed, the first area to investigate the structure-activity relationships between chemicals and their structures, what their efficacies were, was to turn botanicals into synthetic pharmaceuticals. And because it's the life sciences, that is like this with toxicity studies. And these relationships between academia and the new petrochemical industry really literally created and determined the toxicity test methods that are still in use today and totally dominate chemical risk assessment.
You one last question by Andrea?
Actually, two questions. At the beginning, Andrea Sartelli, University of Bergen, and thanks, it was a really fantastic talk. At the beginning, you presented this evolution of kind of fatal attraction between the European Commission, the rising European Commission, and the lobby as some kind of an happenstance. I heard that there has been hypothesis advanced that this is not by an happenstance but by design. What do you think of this? Second question is, you presented a very brilliant diagnosis. Is in your books also a chapter on how you see a solution to this kind of nesting of interest? Is this way the knot can be untied, according to you?
I'm not sure I understood your first point.
Is the European Commission by design meant to serve industrial interests, or it ended up serving industrial interests by the way it happened to find itself by chance, by happenstance?
Right, I'm not sure. So thank you very much for all your questions and your remarks. So of course it's something very simplistic, but it's not only about budget, it's on the possibility to have a counter expertise very precise. And the issue is that I guess today business could write a lot. Well, the best way to answer to your remarks is to say that, oh, you build a position paper when you work for NCAM EU. So in the first page, you are just writing that everything has to be green, you have to save all of the polar bears, you have to be very open with the green process. And then in the second part, you have technical amendments to the Commission proposal. So I'm not so sure that so the work that NGOs are producing is very important because they are rebuilding the links and they are fighting this disconnection between the general principles and the truth of the technical application of and the amendments they actually suggest. But we cannot do that for all the products registered as the European Chemical Agency. And what is very funny is that civil servants from European Chemical Agency can't do that job too. Now, if we were doing an interview with a guy from the European Chemical Agency, we are explaining to you that 95% of the files registered are not opened. Not opened. Just take it. And because the file has to seem well built on the state of art, but they just pick some files that NGOs will point with the finger. So we have a strong dependency of the ability of NGO to dramatize or to focus on some cases. But today I'm not sure that these cases are not suggested by a part of the business. And this is something very strange, but we have to figure out that a part of the business can make some green turning point in the process, and they can use the ecological argument in order to disqualify their competitors. So this kind of, we have to keep this in mind, because sometimes I think NGOs win battles, whereas they are winning battles with the help of a part of the business. It's very hard to say that, and so also to answer to your second question, I have no solution at all. I'm very pessimistic about the next steps, but I think we should just considering the things as scientists. So it's and I think it's the same thing for me for other battles NGO won. Sometimes we win, but we win not alone, with people from business just suggesting some points. And the questions about the EU-US chemistry companies and REACH, it's very funny because now one of the issues of the TTIP is chemistry companies from, as BASF for Europe, trying to have the REACH process in United implemented in the United States through TTIP. So firstly, the European chemical companies were against REACH, but today they are considering that they are just registering their products in an agency quite alone. 70% on the stakeholders committee are from industry. So, and I think they find this regulation may be a commercial weapon against US chemical companies who have to pay people to register their product, and an irony there. I think that sometimes you can find regulations that where business are against, and then they could use it as a tool for economical struggles. And I don't talk about revolving doors in my book. I talk about revolving doors in my book, but just I begin with the case of a young guy who started to work for a national French trade association, MEDEF, and then works for European Commission. And I think that we have a kind of we have a system built with two legs. You have bureaucracy and business, and you have people at each level that can change the sides. But what we have to get in mind is the system. If it's not lobbying against bureaucracy, so you are using law and bureaucracy in order to have a better position in the economical field, to have subsidies, to be inside PPPs, and so you can find bridge, of course, on the two sides, and chemical sectors is not different from this perspective, but for you can't explain this only by a kind of tradition or a kind of just a switch from public to private. It's in both sense, and it's everyday. And we could also say that some careers are built on this ability to be permanently in the revolving door, because you have some steps in the career in business association. Your wage can stay very low, so you try to go to be for an internship 2 years for European Commission, and then you go again on the business side. So it's a permanent revolving door. And your last remark on occupational exposure is for me very important, because I think that we are what we call today the social social dialogue in Brussels. If you take the list of the 1,000 business associations that we made the history today, you will only find 15 of them registered as the European Social Dialogue. And the other part of the European Social Dialogue, there are employers' associations with no means, no employees at all. It's very funny, but the reality of the law is taken. The law taken for the employees, the law that are affecting the daily life of employees, are taken in European Chemical Agency. For instance, if you are a worker for a plant in chemical sectors, all your working conditions are shaped by what is at stake in European Chemical Agency, much more than European Social Dialogue. And for me, it's one of my next research will be what is not labeled as a social dialogue affects the daily life of workers.
Thank you, Sylvain. Okay, one last question. Please make it short, because we're super late, of course.
Yes, I'll just do
no worries. Go ahead.
Because
can you use the microphone?
Because the European Commission and business corporations are so interwoven with each other, can you? Is it fair to label them as like one big corporation, or is that a bit?
You mean, am I considering the business association as a big corporation?
The European Commission,
yeah,
as one body with all these corporations. Like, are they even? Can you consider them separate?
No. For me, it's not. It's not a good thing to think that all the civil servants of European Commission are working directly for companies. They are civil servants. But the truth is that capitalism needs bureaucracy. That's the only thing. So you can't have a market if you haven't any law of ownership, of trade, of so the game is to make this law better for your business. So that's here. The relationship is here. But what is very, very funny that you cannot also build a bureaucracy without having the legitimacy given from the business. At the very beginning of the European Commission is very clear.
Sorry, logistical considerations. I actually had one question. I'm just dropping my moderator's hat. Sorry, I know we are late, but I'm missing one thing in the whole discussion about your presentation is the role of peer-reviewed science, you know, the scientific literature. We've talked about the possibility of a balance of expertise, or actually the impossibility of the balance of expertise between business and NGOs. But NGOs' main resource, as far as I know, being, you know, working for one myself, is indeed the help of the scientific community, you know, whatever gets published in the scientific literature. That is how you can follow in a transparent manner whatever is getting, you know, the advances of knowledge on, you know, the toxicity of a product or something else. So how do you see the interaction between, in a way, the public science and this kind of gray science that you've been describing?
We have to consider the differences between discipline and the area of research. We are talking about disciplines that are close to be only technologies, as nanotechnology, biotech, or this kind of thing. You cannot imagine today a scientist who could be dominant without being funded or at the head of a PPP. So if you're just considering the board of the PCRD programs on nanotechnology, you have half of the board for industry, the other half is for the academics. But if you are just considering the list of academics, half of them have their own company, or they are the head of a cluster of a PPP, so at the national level. So it's you have some sector today in science where technology and industry is so mixed together that I cannot imagine that you could build a counter expertise at the level of scientificity that is required without the means of producing this counter expertise. So we could always think that we find maybe a kind scientist working for us the night or during the vacation. But the truth is that he hasn't any cyclotron or any equipment to build this counter expertise. So it's more and more difficult, in my opinion. And it's not only about conflict of interest. It's about the possibility of to build a counter expertise.
Great answer. Sorry, David, you have to. So thank you very much, Sylvain, for your work and good luck for the. So, due to time constraints and the fact that Mr. Meyer has to leave a bit early, we are switching the order of the two last speakers. So, Mr. Meyer from the GRC is going to speak. David, please take place. You're a last-minute comer to this conference, since you were only added to the speakers list after the conference was publicly announced. But, of course, when you proposed a contribution in the name of the main in-house scientific service of the Commission, it was difficult to not consider it as relevant, obviously, especially what we've just heard about, you know, the importance of publicly funded science to balance a bit whatever expertise Commission has to, business has to provide. So we agreed that you would talk about the challenges of providing impartial evidence for policy making. And on a personal note, may I insist a little bit that you insist about the challenges so that we can have possibly an idea of possible solutions. So can you please be as blunt as you can in the problems you're facing in your work? Thank you very much. You have 15 minutes.
Thanks very much, Martin. And I don't have to leave early. I have to leave exactly on the time foreseen. But I see that you've been having some very good discussions. So congratulations on organising this event and what's happening tomorrow. it is part of my job to go to a lot of discussions about the relationship between science and evidence and policy. And there are an enormous number of these events now in Brussels. In fact, I came from one just before this on big data and policy. So lots of people thinking about how big data should fit into the policy process. Last week, we in the European Parliament organised something called Science Meets Parliaments, when we looked at how scientists should interact with parliamentarians. So this is very much a vogue topic. I have to say what is refreshingly interesting and unusual about this one is almost all the events I go to in this subject are full of scientists, and their constant complaint is how they are utterly ignored by the policy process, and how can they have some influence on the policy process. So it's quite refreshing to have rather a different angle on this debate that you are putting forward. But there's an enormous frustration amongst the scientific community. They do not feel that evidence is percolating through to the policy process. You gave a very short introduction for who we are, but we're not a very well-known part of the Commission, so I perhaps should explain who we are. We have two former doyens of the JRC here as well, who I'm sure can share their experience as scientists working in the JRC. We are, I think it's the second biggest department in the European Commission, but we are not a policy-making department. We are a department made up of scientists, about 2,000 scientists, and our job is to support policy-making inside the Commission by bringing scientific evidence into the policy process. We have all the normal recruitment and remuneration requirements of Commission staff, so if you consider public servants are independent, all the rest of it, we fully comply with that. We are therefore completely independent both of national interests, which is obviously important in the European Union, and of commercial interests. Manifestly, we are not independent of the European Commission because we are an integral part of the European Commission, and my colleague tomorrow will talk about the science advice mechanism, which is designed to put in place some independent scientific advice of the European Commission. We have some sort of a role in pretty much every sort of European Union policy you care to name. We advise pretty much all the DGs of the Commission. Obviously, for some policy areas, we do an awful lot of the science that they need. For others, it's only a little bit, but we do pretty much something for everyone. So we have an ambition to also connect the various bits of advice and evidence that we're providing across the board. We do, of course, have, as on top of the normal Commission deontology on proper administrative behaviour, we have our own code of integrity about how we go about the business of doing our science as well, to make sure that we meet the highest possible scientific standards. Because we're a rather unique organisation, there really aren't so many of us around the world. On the one hand, we have one foot in the scientific community, because to do our job, we cannot do it without connecting to good scientists around the world. But on the other hand, we have a foot in the policy-making community. So we go to the internal Commission meetings that decide on policy, impact assessments, and all the rest of it. Now, we don't do science on every single thing, and listening to your debate, one of the things that we don't do is around the work of EFSA and EDC in Helsinki, because of course those institutions have been created to do the risk assessment there, so there's no point us duplicating the work. We did a lot of the work on chemicals and helped set up the EDC, but once that responsibility passed there, we stopped doing that. But we do an awful lot in all sorts of different places. Getting evidence, good evidence into policy making is, if you take a long view of a historian, pretty important, because if you look at civilization and progress, you can see it's reasonably well correlated with the ability of administrations and governments to better use the knowledge we have about what is happening to humans, societies, economies, and the planet. So doing this is a very important task. It is incredibly difficult. I have a policy background. I used to work in DG Santé. I came to the JRC 4 years ago. And there are a number of problems in trying to connect science and policy. Perhaps not quite the same ones that you've identified. The first one, which I think Silvio touched on a bit, is that there is a fundamental philosophical distinction between what science is trying to do and what policy is trying to do. And it's known in philosophy as the is-ought distinction. So science tells us what is, It tells us what the facts are. And policy making is fundamentally trying to decide what we do about these things. And there is no necessary fundamental link between what is and what should be. These are two quite important different categories. There is a link, but there is no necessary axiomatic link between the two. And therefore that means that the projects of science and policy are also fundamentally different at heart. Scientists are trying to know things, trying to win the battle of truth. And the political battle is actually about trying to do things, which is a different sort of intellectual project. And that's why these things do often intersect. And so there are enormous problems in bringing the worlds of science and evidence together and making them work. The first particular challenge that we see in trying to do this is very simply a problem of timing. The scientific and research cycles and the policy cycles move sometimes at different speeds, but also they happen to be at different places at different times. And the biggest challenge we face is making sure that we are able to produce the evidence at the right place in the right time. And that's incredibly difficult. It means science and scientists have to get better at understanding where policy is going and making sure their research is ready when it's there. We do have some challenges about trying to understand how far scientists should go in involving themselves in the debate. There's a number of interesting categories out there people have looked at. The important thing is not only to provide your evidence, but we see it as also helping policymakers come up with options. At the end, it is for the policymakers and the politicians to decide on the options, but we see our role as helping to put forward more options and help the policymaker understand the differences between these options. The last challenge that we face in trying to connect evidence and policy is around communication. The communication styles of scientists and policymakers are utterly different, and we have a major problem. We've just run a summer school for young policymakers and scientists with IASA, the organisation that does systems analysis, and one of the repeated mantras is, a policymaker needs 3 bullet points. They don't need a 200-page scientific report. So if scientists are unable to communicate their work in that format, that's not going to work. So all the challenges we see, or many of the challenges we see, are around some really quite sort of, if you like, practical, commonsensical problems which we face on a daily basis, which is how to improve the conversations between scientists and policymakers. And what we tell our colleagues is, if you want, and they do have their mandate is to try and bring the evidence into the policy debate. We have an objective to make sure the Commission takes decisions on the best possible available evidence. What we say is you won't have any impact unless you are trusted by the policymakers, so you have to build a relationship of trust. They have to see that you are honest and can give good advice. You have to give them the information they need in a digestible, easy-to-use format, because policymakers are just utterly bombarded with knowledge these days. And you have to give this knowledge at the time they need it and answer the question that policymakers want answered. Question of independence is a tricky one. I think we've explored it quite well here. I mean, hearing the discussions, I'm minded to recall what Lord Robert Winston said. So he's a famous doctor in the House of Lords, and his conclusion is that there is no such thing as an independent scientist. No, it is just impossible for an individual to be independent. Independence you get from building institutions which collectively have checks and balances and peer reviews and all the rest of it to bring about independence. So the idea that there is some sea green, incorruptible individual is in his view not possible. And the other reflection I had hearing the discussions is, from a scientific point of view, perhaps we should concentrate on the independent replicability and repeatability of results. That is surely the acid test, to make sure that science is replicable and the experiments have been repeated by someone who is independent of the people who did it. Maybe we should concentrate on that from a scientific point of view, rather than concerning ourselves too much about the revenue stream of the people who produced the science. Andrea will, I'm sure, be telling you a lot about the problems we face of science itself, so we struggle with those. There are many endemic problems that science faces that we have to deal with. as to an attempt to way forward, what we say to our colleagues who, the challenge they do often face is their research produces something which is inconvenient to the policymaker, it was unexpected. And what we say within the JRC is that we've now moved to a rather different world of policy making, certainly to the one that was there when I started in the Commission, that thanks to the internet and the proliferation of knowledge out there, if the Commission does something wrong and mistaken in its policy and doesn't take into account the evidence, then this will be discovered by the process sooner or later. We have such a sort of open internet-based culture of looking at work that there will be someone who will spot the flaw in the results sooner or later. So what we say is, look, it's better that we are the internal critical friend who points out the flaws in this work in advance. So as we move towards more open policy making and transparency, and by the way, we clearly make sure that all our stuff is open to public scrutiny and published in peer-reviewed journals and the rest of it. That, I think, is probably the way forward to address these issues.
Short and sweet. Thank you very much. I would have several questions myself, but I'm not allowed. You know, I'm the moderator. But fortunately, I see many questions in the room. So let's take, well, as we did previously, 4 in a row. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Gentlemen in the back. You'll be last.
Thank you. My name is Vito Buonsante. I work for Client Earth, an environmental NGO, and I work mainly on chemicals. I have several questions or clarification because, interestingly enough, I couldn't agree with one single thing you said. So it would be interesting if you clarified. For example, you said that scientific cycles are different than policy cycles, and in my experience as a campaigner or expert on chemical legislation, I see that policy always comes way behind. Like, you know, we know that asbestos has been hazardous for 30 years, for 50 years, or maybe 100 years, but it takes really a long time to get the policy to act on it, and we can go on up to the EDC discussion where science is way ahead of policy, and policy is just trying to slow things down. You're saying that scientists are difficulties in communicating because, like, these difficult data that they're crunching, and while institutions that should really communicate to the public and actually even consult the public, let's say substance is a very high concern at public consultation, where we're thrown like documents of 300, 400 pages that we are supposed to give as citizens feedback to. I see that not a problem of the scientific community, but mainly a problem from the institutional side. And the fact that scientists need to be trusted by policymakers as opposite to who are the other science givers, which is usually industry, from which you get science in many processes. Like you're saying that the science from industry, you're implying, but so that's why I would get that clarification that industry, because of the replicability and the repeatability of their tests, are more trusted. So it's difficult to understand. And finally, something on, and I conclude here on the independence. It's true, none of us is independent, but public institutions work for the public interest. So you should be biased toward the public interest, while their other vested interests are something different. So we can at least make that sort of distinction when we look at what kind of bias we have. Thanks.
Next question. David.
Me?
Didn't you have a question?
Yeah, well, she could go first.
Sorry, Gilly, you go first.
Yes. Yes, my name is Agili Simahu. I work for Pesticide Action Network Europe, and I'm actually a research scientist myself, environmental toxicologist. Yeah. And just one comment after, I mean, Victor covered a lot, but there is one that you said at the end that if a policy is not based on solid science, this will be discovered. But for example, right now we have, scientifically, there's lots of cases. I mean, I work with the toxicity of pesticides, and there's lots of cases, for example, we don't test mixtures, although we have scientific evidence that mixtures may have additive effects, and we know this. And we have the case of endocrine disruptors in the NOAL, that we haven't changed them because of endocrine disruption yet. I mean, there's lots of cases that we have scientific evidence. What's your role on this?
Yes, I'm David Hammerstein. I represent the Transatlantic Consumer Dialogue, which is a forum of consumer groups. I was previously in the European Parliament. I was the rapporteur for the Joint Research Center in Ispra. I've been there many times. I've spoken to many of the scientists there, for example, on issues of nanotechnology, issues of dangerous chemicals, alternatives to animal experiments, et cetera, et cetera. And what I think is very, very clear is a number of things. First of all, the European Commission cherry picks totally the policy things from JRC. Second of all, the scientific results of JRC are not socialized. They're not democratic. The people in this room are not interacting with that result. It's kind of like the scientists are researching in a cave, and they're picking out the policy, and the politicians, or what I call or the state market or the market state, are picking out what is very useful. What we need is, I would say, is a little bit what Bruno Latour is talking about. We need a kind of a parliament of the things, of the scientific things, to have a mediation, a democratic mediation of the things, with mediators, democratic mediators of what's happening with science. I don't agree with you at all that this is about the battle for the truth. I think obviously in the scientific debate, this is a very pre-Thomas Kuhn kind of argument, the kind of Newtonian physics of 100 years ago. And I think that's not at all the scientific debate today. This is like prehistoric. And I think what we're talking about today is something where there are many different scientific truths. There are paradigms that are falling apart. There are some opinions facing other opinions. For example, opinions of scientists I've spoken about in Ispra about nanotech, saying this is a totally new world. The acting regulations do not fit at all. And that message that's like a consensus of the people I spoke with at Ispra, that never comes to the European Parliament, that point of view. But I could give many more opinions on other issues like in that way. So what we're talking about is not the truth, we're talking about the convenient truth for certain people according to certain options. I'm not saying there are great people doing great work in Ispra, the 2000 Science, but what is not happening, we're not having that debate, a democratic mediation. It's not getting out. We're not having, let's say, with public interest groups, people who could act as those mediators or actantes, I don't know how to say exactly, of those kind of things and elements that are going on there. So I think this is a great deficit, and I think it's tremendously underused for the public interest, the kind of the research you are doing. And I think the policy is often used to defend what the scientists are against, what they're finding against. And I can give many, many, many examples. So I think what we need is a complex science, is socially responsible, and especially it's much more democratic, and to admit that there's all these scientific debates going on. And there are many paradigms. And I, of course, don't agree with you, and I agree with you there, that, someday someone will find out that this isn't true, obviously. But when the genie is out of the bottle, when we're talking about dangerous chemicals, when we're talking about pharmaceuticals, when we're talking about animal experiments, et cetera, it's often very too late. And it's not about risk analysis, it's really about danger, things that are already happened. Thank you.
Yeah, well, the control is too late to control.
Professor Milstead, and then we had the last question in the back.
I maybe don't need a microphone.
You do need, I'm afraid, for the people who are following us from the internet.
Okay. I was very puzzled by one of the comments you made towards the very end of your presentation, where you talked about replicability of studies. That seems to rule out all prospective epidemiological work, because almost by definition you can't reproduce the circumstances of exposure and the particular environmental and historical conditions. And if you rule out all of that kind of epidemiology, you end up with very narrow scientific base, don't you?
Well, one question in the back, then one last question by Sylvain, and then we will give actually a chance to David to answer all these points.
It's hard to remember the ones at the beginning.
Yes, Jamie Page again from the Cancer Prevention Society. You talked about the history of philosophy of science and the is and the ought, and I had alluded to it earlier on in my comment about splitting out and whether you actually go ahead and do it. I think that's kind of idealized, and as somebody said, that's sort of how science should be. But because science is now conflated with technology, the scientists aren't saying these are the possibilities. If you take, this is not my field, but if you do take the example of plant genetics and genetic modification, they all have, well not they all, I don't want to overgeneralize, but a lot of them have vested interest in this technology, so they're acting already as advocates for the technology. So they're technologists, they're not scientists, because if they were scientists, there are a lot of scientists out there, they don't get any voice, who have serious doubts about the technology, but they're not heard. So I don't think you can say that the scientists nowadays are the is people, because they're acting as the ought people. This is the problem, as I think.
One last small point by Sylvain, and then David is your turn.
Yeah, just a small point that we should not consider that repetition of the same argument given by business is replication. Because when you attend to internal meetings of business association, they're just looking at the effect that produce the copy and paste of the same literature, the same argument, through different ways, different think tanks, different institutes, different business associations. So the true replication would be that a public force, a public administration could access to the plants and make its own measure. This would be a true replication, a true scientific approach of this issue. But on a lot of cases, we are very, very dependent of the numbers given by the industry because they just have access to the plants.
Thank you. David.
Thank you. Yes. Try and pick up all those issues, quite a lot there. My comment on cycles was not to say always that the science is ahead of the policy, or the policy can equally be ahead of the science. The policy demand to act comes out, and we don't have the science. The work hasn't been done, but nevertheless the politician wants to act. And my point was merely that the cycles are not synchronized. Many scientists, perhaps ones more on the ought side, complain that in GMOs the policy is way behind the science, and the science has decided. So my point was not to say one is always ahead or one is always behind. My point is that the synchronization, and in the practical sense of getting the evidence into policy, a common problem, and this was the challenge to me. How do I see the problem inside the JRC? So I'm commenting for how we see the problem in our particular role, not how all scientists see the problem. And one of the challenges we face is, it's actually outside the Commission. Some scientists will come with a piece of work the week after the Commission has adopted the proposal. And we say, that's really interesting, great piece of work, but of absolutely no benefit and use at all because you are a week too late. Or equally, before the political debate has taken off. So if we want to be serious about getting evidence to have an impact on the policy, scientists need to understand what is happening in the policy cycle, because in politics, an awful lot of it is context and timing. And if we don't get that right, then we don't have a hope of trying to influence how the policy debate takes out. So that was to perhaps clarify my remark there. That's an important question which we spend a lot of our time trying to get right. Question of we should consult and be open. I think perhaps as the JRC we could be better at being more open. We tend to be very focused on dealing with the scientific community and the policy community. We're not terribly good actually at dealing with either industry or with NGOs, and one of the reasons why I very much wanted to come to this event and Martin, you said you hadn't really heard much about us before. Was because for a long time I have realised that we are not so terribly well known amongst the NGO community in Brussels. So one of the things I wanted to come here is to say, look, we do exist, and if you're interested in our work, come and talk to us about it, and you can come and visit our labs, and you will find all sorts of interesting people working on these issues, including on endocrine disruptors and all sorts of other things. So we are, as a public service, open to people to come and inspect our work. That's absolutely the mantra of what we do. So that perhaps addresses the question of what is the public interest. You know, we are a service of the Commission working in the public interest. We have the full barrage of rules that are designed to ensure Commission public servants do work in the public interest, and on top of them we have a series of scientific integrity rules to make sure that our science is of the highest possible integrity, because we are using taxpayers' money to produce science, and there's no point for us to be paid by the taxpayer if we're not producing science which is independent of commercial or national interest. That is our entire raison d'etre for existence. Now, it's for others to judge whether we do that. It's for others to judge whether the rest of the Commission cherry picks our work. I don't honestly see that, but that's really for others to judge, not for me. One thing I said at the beginning, we are of course inside the process, so we are not independent of the Commission. We are giving scientific advice inside the process. If you look at the people who are talking a lot about scientific advice at the moment, they basically say there are two types of scientific advice. There are the people who are inside the process, and that conveys enormous advantages to be in the meeting rooms, for us to be able to talk to people in policy DGs as peers, as trusted peers. That gives us a voice at the moment when policy is being decided. But there are advantages also if you're outside the system, then you can throw tomatoes at whatever you think the policy is being produced. And we don't do that. We are an integral part of the Commission, and that is why Commissioner Modash has reacted to set up the mechanism that you will hear about today. So that means that the Commission has both access to internal scientific advice, which is independent of commercial and national interests, and then we have now, with the SAM, this independent scientific advice. In terms of the replicability of results, I'm certainly not saying abandon epidemiology at all, but I'm putting a point which I think is well made, that what is the heart of the scientific enterprise? The heart of the scientific enterprise is to repeat and be able to replicate results, and that is an essential element in science, and therefore that is something not to be forgotten in the debate about independence. We appear to have gone completely into the debate about who is funding the science and what are their interests and which side of the fence they are, but perhaps I wanted just to bring back to this question of what is at the heart of the scientific enterprise, which is the ability to replicate and repeat results. My notes are not so good. I hope I've covered all the points, but if there are things that people want to come back on, because there was... You gave me 6 questions there. Yes, can you please say it again?
Yeah, my point was about is an ought, and you gave us kind of, to my mind, idealized historic notion of is and ought. But my point was that because modern scientists are very often technologists as opposed to scientists, they have the bias of their profession, like surgeons like to operate.
Oncologists like to treat, And so this professional bias that the technologists, I don't call them scientists, I call them technologists, have towards, if those are the people giving guidance on the science, you're going to get a very distorted view. And my concern is, A, there aren't enough independent scientists, and B, that the few ones that there are aren't being consulted. This is the point. I don't think I heard your answer.
Okay, indeed. Well, I mean, I can't speak for all scientists. I can speak for how we deal with this issue in-house. And I have to say this is something that comes up all the time, and amongst my colleagues actually, perhaps because they are paid by the taxpayer and they're not allowed to accept remuneration for anything else. I don't know what the reason is, but where we see this issue more is actually they are more reluctant to jump into the policy field. And so I have relatively few examples I've come across in my career of JRC scientists wanting to do this. Now maybe it's because of the way we're set up and funded, So this is a real question for us in the JRC. Is what I want to do is to try and encourage my colleagues not to start pushing a particular policy line, but doing the classic job of scientists giving advice to policymakers, which is putting other options on the table and helping the policymakers evaluate between the objectives.
Sorry, we'll take a last short question by Nicholas, and then we will wrap this.
I'm going to ask a direct question having to do with the real problem.
Nicola, if you can use the
Real
microphone.
problem, and I'd like to have you give me an answer that you think will stand. We know in the United States that distracted driving due to texting ends up, the data are there that it causes many more fatal accidents. The automobile industry, both here and abroad, are putting video display terminals in cars. They are obviously going to be a physical distraction. There are no data to date as to whether or not people who have video display terminals and can do their email through the computer, look up the restaurant they want to go to, there's no evidence that this is a danger. What, if you were asked for advice, would you say, sorry, there's no data? Would you say it ought to be studied? No, actually, I think the government really needs to seriously look at this problem. It's a very common sense problem. Data are not there. What's your answer?
So we study what the rest of the Commission wants us to study. So we are not independent of the Commission. So our work programme and every single piece of work we do, we have, it's written in Horizon 2020 and it's written in our basic decisions. We do the work that the people who make the policy decide they need done. Now that doesn't mean that they decide what the results are, but we don't just do work without making sure that there is someone in the policy. So if the people in DG Move come to us and say, we need you to do this work, then we do it.
You didn't answer the question. I said, what would you advise? What would you advise with regard to video display terminals put in automobiles by the automobile industry? This is a problem where the technology is moving faster than the law or the policy. And somebody in the Commission says, look, I just lost a nephew. He died because of this. I want to know what the JRC is going to contribute today to this decision.
Well, I'm not personally. I don't know so much about that, but I think what we could say is, we see this as a problem. This is what could be done, and we do that all the time. We suggest possible lines of research to the people making the policy, and at the end, if they want to do this work, then we do it.
Do you need research? Do you need research?
Do we need research? Yes.
For this question?
I don't know. I don't know enough about the question to know what we need.
All people in the room, I think, will know the answer.
Have you checked Volkswagen emissions? Have you not? I know on car emissions, the JRC has agreements with a lot of car manufacturers. I think you have had agreements with Volkswagen on their car emissions. Have all of those reports been published? Do you agree on the emissions of 11 million cars have now been recalled? Has the JRC given as good the official emissions report given by Volkswagen?
So we certainly are involved in the emissions testing. We have the laboratories, I think you know well, in ISPRA, the Vela laboratories. I do not think, I don't know yet, but because we've only just heard the story yesterday, but I'm not aware that we were aware of these problems and we had detected them. We are in the process of designing a robust testing regime which captures real-life driving testing, and I would hope that captures also, the real experience of the car, and that we have a testing regime which captures any defeat, but I don't know the facts of that particular case.
Sorry, David.
JRC confirmed the Volkswagen emission rates.
Oh, David, I'm very sorry. David, I authorized the other David not to answer this question.
Okay.
And I'm going to thank you very much. Now you're welcome for coming here to subject. I'm sorry. sorry, we are very late, but I still will ask a bit of your time to listen to a very, very interesting and underlooked area of research that's going to be presented by another sociologist. Thank you, David. Thanks for coming again. And, we have filmed everything, so we will send you all the links. But it's,
Perfect. Keep me on for the next. I will get on your next.
Pleasure. So. So David, I'm sorry, you don't have an easy task. Your research is very specific. You'll come last. It's the end of the day. Please, everyone, once all this is done, we will serve dinner and aperitif to everyone upstairs. So be patient and attentive, please. David, you are also a political sociologist. Actually, you're also a former lobbyist in Brussels. You've changed careers along the path. You're now working with the French National Institute for Agronomic Research and the London School of Economics. And I wanted very much to invite you to contribute to this conference because you've been researching a rather obscure but essential question, that is, the regulatory power of scientists themselves. In a very interesting book published in 2011 titled Scientists and the Regulation of Risk, you documented how scientists play an increasing and essential role in the standardization of risk assessment. Given that these standards, such as international experimental protocols designed by the OECD, are used on a quasi-daily basis by public authorities for organizing the risk assessment of products before these are allowed to enter the market or not, I thought your contribution could be an excellent addition to this conference. I specifically asked you to answer the following questions. What defines...
My talk is already written, but...
That's fine. You will hear the questions nevertheless. What defines acceptable evidence for policy making, in particular for regulated industry products such as medicines, foodstuffs, chemicals? How are these definitions crafted and by whom? To what extent is this system permeable to special interest influence? So thank you again for coming, for joining our discussion. You have 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin, for organizing the event. Like other speakers, I find this an unusual and welcome event, and thank you for inviting me. So I'll jump in the topic right away and come back to things that were said in passing earlier by Silvio and others about risk assessment and regulatory science and what's called the paradigm of regulatory science, risk assessment. And basically, the question is risk assessment and regulatory science more generally, is it somehow the product of regulatory capture or not? I mean, this is a legitimate question since there are people here and there who complain about the fact that risk assessment produces a sort of a false sense of safety and of control, and that structurally, basically, it is not a very easy tool to ban products or to put products out of the market. Basically, it seems that structurally, and again, I'm not speaking. I mean, here I'm sort of conveying the thoughts of others. Basically, risk assessment will be biased towards sort of letting products go on the market and stay on the market. So there could be suspicions that, yeah, paradigmatically speaking, sort of risk assessment is captured. I mean, it goes in the sort of in the interest of the industry to keep its products on the market. So that's the question I want to ask. Is this so? And if it is so, by what mechanisms, concretely speaking, does it happen? I need to make a precision first, because words are important, and some of the words we use generally to think about those things are not helpful. Regulatory capture, first and foremost, is a striking term, a spectacular term, but it's not helpful. In this sense that it's very general, it merges different degrees and mechanisms of regulatory capture, and often we don't distinguish clearly what's going on if we think in those terms. So you will see that I will be speaking much more in terms of cultural capture, borrowing a term by a political scientist in the US, James Quack, as part of in a book that is in the reading list that you circulated on preventing regulatory capture. Science is not a helpful term either. You might be surprised to hear, but in fact, if we speak in terms of science, then we will be bound to speak in terms of knowledge that corresponds to certain ideals and well, you choose the ideals, but it's going to be transparency and replicability and quantification, obviously, and so on. And if we think in terms, but we're bound to find that the research that is used for regulatory purposes is sort of at fault or at distance with these ideals. And therefore, we're going to end up in a fight between so industry accusing NGOs saying, your science is militant science, our science is better. And then NGOs responding, you do corporate science, it's biased. And then researchers accusing experts of doing regulatory science. And trust me, in their discourse, regulatory science is almost an insult. So we end up with a not very helpful fight about, so where is really the true science? So what I'm going to do here is to switch and speak of regulatory knowledge, okay? And take this sort of basic assumption that to do regulatory decisions or non-decisions, that's important, we use knowledge of different types from different sources, potentially from very different sources. Some knowledge is very close to what we would call scientific knowledge, but the rest of the knowledge we use is sometimes very tacit. It's close to experience about products and knowledge of markets. I mean, all of that is invested in regulatory decisions. And so faced with that field of knowledge, the question becomes, so who selects the knowledge that is going to go into a decision? And since this is the topic of the conference, do industry actors have relatively more influence over this kind of selection of knowledge, and specifically more influence on what we can call standards of proof, standards of evidence, or again, the norms of regulatory knowledge? Because as you know, the knowledge that is produced for regulation is based on certain norms and paradigms. And so you know those names, those sometimes exotic names we get used to, but which are really exotic. So risk assessment and computer an allowable daily intake and I mean, you name them. Substantial equivalence, José Bové mentioned that. All of those regulatory concepts that define a kind of knowledge that should be produced to make a decision. And it does not only define a type of knowledge, it also defines a regulatory mechanism, how we make a decision based on that. And again, there are many more of these concepts. Nowadays, there are a lot of discussions about threshold of toxicological concern, the ideas being that, okay, if you can compare several chemicals, then if one is safe, the other will be safe too, and then we can let it go on the market and so on. I mean, there are many other examples. So what I want to do, and I need to go fast, I'm sorry, but since time flies, and Eric afterwards will have to wrap this up. I'm going to take one example and then try to show where does industry intervene, you know, in the process of shaping this sort of regulatory knowledge kind of norms. So my example is drawn from the field of novel foods and functional foods. So there's one such norm of knowledge in the area, which is to say that when we are uncertain about one particular point after a risk assessment, then it is possible to set up a so-called post-market monitoring scheme. Okay, so PMM, post-market monitoring. That would be a sort of norm of knowledge. And the idea behind that is that there's a scientific side to the concept, which is that a post-market monitoring study can pick up certain effects, certain adverse effects linked to consumption of the product. Certain adverse effects, not all of them. It's limited. And the sort of the more legal side of it is to say that such a study should only be undertaken to clarify certain points that are left open after a risk assessment on certain hypotheses that were developed during the assessment of the product, pre-market. Okay. So if you take that example, PMM, post-market monitoring, so how did it come about? First, it has a very long history. The first experiments of that practice and the first mention of that concept dates back to the 1980s. Okay? and it became sort of common and acceptable sort of concept after a long transnational process involving experiments in various places, in various companies, in Japan, in Europe, in the US. Also some experiments in certain public research laboratories, certain experiments in certain regulatory agencies or ministries, like at the time in the UK, the Ministry for Agriculture, Food and Fisheries, who tried to push companies who were developing functional foods to test this kind of monitoring. So some sort of experiment going on here and there. And then a lot of assessment, and you could say theorization of that practice, with a lot of meetings of learning societies getting involved in the debate, trade associations also organizing their own discussion on the topic. And then you see the ILSI, the International Life Science Institute, setting up its working group to discuss the idea. And then, of course, you see emerging an EU-funded research project specifically dedicated, a work package dedicated to the idea and so on and so forth. And also, obviously, the unavoidable OECD and WHO workshops with experts to discuss the practice. So a long transnational process of experimenting, reflecting on the concept to gradually arrive to one single and common version of it that is almost ready to be picked up in law. Okay? So what about the industry actors in that context? First, you need to recognize that they are here at the outset, okay, and sort of legitimately so, because it's the R&D departments of these companies, which I'm not naming here, but that just had the idea, try to test the practice, the first, and then try to elaborate on and to see the consequences of these kind of studies on what they would reveal of their products and what would be the regulatory consequences of delivering that sort of data and so on. So they are here at the outset, and they're developing the idea as part of early conversations with regulators and MAF, I mentioned earlier. Then in terms of all of these meetings through which the concept and the practice is sort of theorized and generalized, the industry is also present in most of these places. I mentioned trade associations, learning societies, ILSI, and so on and so forth. They would have, if you take one single company and people from the R&D service of that company, they would go to these different meetings and sometimes not just follow the discussions, but try to shape the discussions, obviously, make sure the sort of right people are represented to sort of carry on the discussion and make sure consensus is being shaped and so on and so forth. Make sure being consistent, sort of, and almost ubiquitous in this discussion, transnationally. Okay, set up groups of people that, over time, are gonna think alike and look alike, and they therefore reinforce the concept. And there again, concretely, the companies that experimented post-market monitoring then went to ILSI to organize this working group and then set up the EU-funded research project and so on, and sort of diffused to make sure the discussion would continue.
David, excuse me to cut you, but perhaps not everybody is familiar with what ILSI is.
Okay, this is a slippery question, but the International Life Science Institute is, there are different qualifications for this institute, but it's it works by setting up working groups involving industry scientists and academic scientists to discuss issues relevant for the risk assessment of products, food products, chemical products, and it's funded. By chemical and agrochemical and food companies. Okay, so I've seen the evolution over time about how the ILSI was presented, and about 10 years ago it was still presented as a scientific organization, and now it's it's a lobby group. If I use, it's not my words, it's Vito's words. Okay, so you'll make your opinion on that. And then the third step is obviously lobbying stricto sensu. Getting the kind of lobbying that Sylvain presented. Really trying to make sure you get specific access to the Commission, to the Parliament, to try to influence the writing of an amendment, of a guideline, and so on. Okay. So, but in a sense, this kind of lobbying almost doesn't matter much if the rest of the, you could call the orchestration work that went on before to make sure there's an intellectual convergence around one way of thinking and one way of seeing the risk happened already. Okay. So to conclude, I just want to give a few more general points to draw from this. I'll just reiterate that. I mean, really, you need to see lobbying not just as a question of the access that you're trying to get to one given policymaker to defend your product or influence the writing of legislation, but this sort of orchestration and circulation of certain ideas about policy and about how to test products. And this is happening very much upstream, and it's much more sort of, you could say, discreet and much harder to trace than any other sort of more direct kind of lobbying. I think, again, this kind of, you might have the impression that I've talked about something very specific, but in fact shaping regulatory knowledge is really key, because what happens through that is that you set up the kind of knowledge and decision machinery that regulatory agencies need, you know, to produce scientific opinions and decisions, and they do that day by day by dozens and hundreds and stuff. So if you set up the norm, if you set up the protocol, obviously you have a massive edge. Okay. Perhaps two, three last points about the actors involved. In terms of considering the industry, we often speak about the industry as a whole, if all of the companies together and all of the people inside the company were one and the same thing. Well, you need to differentiate between different companies who compete with each other through lobbying and through this kind of work. And you need to look inside companies. We focused a lot on what people in regulatory affairs would do and people who are sitting here in Brussels would do. But in that kind of stories, the fact that companies and large companies have big R&D departments with a lot of scientists ready to and able to produce these ideas, to defend these ideas, to publish, to travel to meetings, and to over long periods of time to shape thinking is really key. Okay. Last point. What about regulatory agencies in all of this? Okay, we have work by Dan Carpenter, a professor in Harvard, about what he calls the conceptual power of the FDA. Okay, and based on that work, we can say that agencies like the FDA and partly the Environmental Protection Agency also have some conceptual power. And in fact, if you trace certain regulatory concepts, if you trace, for instance, the history of the thinking in terms of phases of clinical trials, Dan Carpenter did the work and showed that the FDA has really been strong in that. I recently did work on the history of the QSAR concept, okay, quantitative structure-activity relationship, which is applied in the framework of REACH. And there you can really single-handedly point to the EPA as being the source of that. Okay, so they have conceptual power. Compared to that, I would say, but again, it's inspired from my research, but it's not verified, that regulatory agencies in Europe are much more sort of takers of these norms rather than makers. Okay, and that perhaps because they are younger and they are less well-staffed than their US counterparts. But that would be the sort of observation I can make. And even there, Dan Carpenter and his work on FDA now seems to diagnose the fact that there's a shift of the site of conceptual power from the FDA to global pharmaceutical industry, and he's doing work on that at the moment. And that would again show that these global industries are conscious of the needs and benefits of engaging in this transnational shaping of regulatory knowledge, upstream of more concrete and direct lobbying on products and directives, And this is one important field and place where lobbying and potentially capture takes place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. This is very, very interesting. Do people have questions? Yes, Francesca.
So, Francesca Achterberg from Greenpeace. I have I think it's more a clarification really. So you used the example of post-market monitoring, but what I didn't get from your presentation is that a useful concept, or is it, you know, something that is only a trick for companies to pass, you know, products through the approval system that shouldn't ever have passed? Like, how do you see the concept itself? I mean, you did explain very well how it was shaped by large corporations and their R&D departments, and through various, you know, upstream, you called it, you know, cycles, sort of before it even became a regulatory a concept in the EU and elsewhere. But what I didn't get is like what you think the meaning of it is and the usefulness. Second question is, you talked about how corporations and various institutes have shaped this. Has there been any influence by NGOs or any public interest groups in this process that you described?
Okay, so I guess I'm answering right away. In terms of the concept itself, what's the context? If you look at novel foods or functional foods, sort of legitimate demand would be that at the time of risk assessment, we don't know everything about the effects of these products in larger populations. So just like we think in terms for medicines, okay, clinical trials help pointing to certain effects, but we need to monitor what's going on afterwards, because then the product reaches much larger populations. So what really the challenge was for the food companies that were involved here was to restrict the possibility to do post-market monitoring, not as a sort of open and constant surveillance of the consumption of products, because that would tend to go towards post-market surveillance like for medicines, which is, I mean, heavy and costly and so on, and to restrict it to only very well-identified topics. So that's what was written down in those guidelines and texts, and what's incorporated in the concept is that you only do post-market monitoring for certain things on which there are remaining uncertainties at the time of marketing. Okay, so you restrict the application of that technique to a narrower range of issues. Okay, so that's in this sense that the concept was sort of a defense for the food companies involved. So it differentiated from the sort of more ambitious surveillance that goes on for pharmaceuticals. And so, as far as I can tell, based on the concepts that I followed and the history that I tried to describe, no, and environmental or health NGOs are absent. Okay, so this might be changing. This might not be a sort of general observation, because in other cases this might not be the case. But yeah, basically they're not here.
David, Angeliki, and Eric. You see that you're already with the mic in your hand.
Okay. Shall I start then?
Go ahead.
All right. Thank you for the presentations. We're already touching on the heart of a battle with this concept as a presentation before. And in my little experience, this concept most of the time have been designed not to find any problem, of course, and they're extremely difficult for NGOs to influence because of the types of resources needed to construct them, as you described very well. And my question is, sorry, I lost the thread, but no, I mean, the point is that even when the legislators express a clear will, like for example, I think for pesticides, the legislators say that peer-reviewed studies should be taken into account, for example. On GMOs in 2001, the legislators said indirect risk, cumulative risk, long-term risk have to be assessed. But then, if this is implemented by scientific committees or European agencies, then there is no control over that, and that's where this concept comes into play. And in some cases, the the way they are designed, they actually bypass, the will expressed by the legislator. So my question is that how to solve that? Could the solution be to hold the expert liable, legally liable, in case of problems, for example? Could a solution be to change the way they are nominated in the expert agencies, in the scientific committees? And for example, making sure you have industry expert on the one side, identified as industry expert, and experts, selected by NGOs on the other side, for example, that could be a way to really identify where are the scientific uncertainties, the disagreements, and then the policymakers could take a decision, with this identified. I mean, what are the solutions to avoid this corporate capture on regulatory science?
Just a quick question. As your example is about novel food, so I guess about pre-market authorization, did you do any research or did you notice any difference in processes that are pre-market authorization or post-market, bans? Because at the beginning you referred to the bias toward keeping a product on the market or a bias towards putting a product on the market. Like working on industrial chemicals, I see always the bias of keeping, and the burden of proof is on the regulator to show that the product has to be retired from the market, and it's very difficult to prove if there's a problem. So it would be interesting to see if there's a difference in bias towards pre-market and or post-market ban. So I'll keep it short.
Yes, I think we're seeing a change in the industry discourse and even the NGO discourse between certainty and uncertainty, between pre-market authorization, post-market authorization. Take, for example, the 21st Century Cures Act in the United States today, and what's being pushed by the pharmaceutical industry on both sides of the Atlantic, which is adaptive licensing, which is actually asking for early market access without going through the whole clinical trial process. And then we'll see if there's pharmacovigilance, we'll see if there's problems, we will discuss things afterwards because they want your product out in the market. Whereas the NGO community used to be applying a more complex science where they said there's lots of uncertainties and that's why we have to apply the precautionary principle. And often the industry is using a reductionist science that was kind of, monocausal, well, this chemical does not cause this disease. And that uncertainty was being used by the NGOs to stop saying, because, well, now, obviously, the burden of proof is often the opposite. It's saying, well, okay, we are going to take on as industry the postmodern argument that science is very complex. There are tons of uncertainties that we just don't know. And we have to exchange. In the case of pharmaceuticals, what they're saying openly, the top scientific officer of the European Medicines Agency is, we have to make an exchange between certainty, less certainty, for more access to the market of our products, and more access, obviously, to patients, and etc. So we see, I think, a switch. Obviously, they're playing on both sides of the fence at the same time. The postmodern uncertainty argument and the reductionist science argument at the same time. But I think as NGO community, we have to be conscious of these conceptual, cultural kind of flips. And I've been flabbergasted over the last few years seeing how many of our opponents have made that switch from reductionist science to postmodern science, saying, oh, just let 1,000 flowers bloom, everything is uncertain, so we should just bring it out to the market anyways and see if there are problems.
Thanks. David, can you answer? No,
And then we have another question?
No, I'm sorry, we're already 45 minutes and we still need to hear the conclusions, the observations, at least, of Professor Meister.
Sure. So, starting from the last comment, yes, it seems to me that uncertainty is one also of these not helpful words because they're used for different purposes with different meanings by different people and often by opposite people. And it seems quite clear to me that yes, there are. certain companies and scientists in companies or associated scientists who would stress uncertainties basically as a way to say that how shall I put this? To prevent regulatory agencies from making decisions, quite simply. Say, no, you cannot ban a product. There are remaining uncertainties. So which is the exact symmetrical discourse of environmental NGOs or environmental scientists would say, you cannot put that product on the market. There are remaining uncertainties. So you see, uncertainty is a battlefield in itself. So I totally agree with that. On the notion that it would be more difficult at the end of it to take a product out of the market than put it on the market. One of the observations you can make is that the higher you set the requirements for evidence to put a product on the market, the more difficult you make the situation to take the product out of the market. And there's a very strong imbalance here because basically the kind of knowledge that we use to put a product on the market is experimental knowledge, okay? Experimental tests, which you can control and replicate, and you can statistically control and so on. Whereas when you are in the post-market area, just like Eric mentioned in the question to David there, you end up with epidemiological work, and epidemiological work is much more difficult, obviously, to replicate. Epidemiologists refrain from speaking about causes. They identify correlations, but they would shy away from causes, whereas to put a product on the market, you need to, companies would say they have proven through clinical trial or what have you, that the product causes a beneficial effect and so on. So you see in terms of putting a certain standard of proof, then by definition structurally it makes it more difficult to take products out of the market. Okay. What's the solution? As a social scientist, I'm not really well placed to make any sort of recommendations to imagine solutions, but it seems to me that one of the key things is obviously in terms of lies in the capacity of regulatory agencies to actually produce themselves these methodologies and protocols and concepts rather than just follow the discussions out there. Okay. And obviously in Europe we rely a lot on scientific committees and external experts, and the EFSA at its beginning in particular, it was very striking that its main scientific committee was constantly discussing concepts and ideas coming from ILSI rather than producing its own, and that I guess basically has also to do with the fact that it's borrowing the expertise of people outside rather than being in a position to produce its own. And but EFSA in a sense is not to blame for this. It's how legislation has designed it. So I'm done, I think. Thank you.
Professor Millstone, you have a very easy task. Summarize everything we've said in 5 minutes. No, not 5 minutes, I'm joking. Take the time you need. I see that you've even made a small presentation. That's very
well,
interesting.
I have been preparing. To summarize 4.5 hours in 15 minutes is ridiculous, but it's also not in anyone's interest that I stand between us, and the food and drink. So I assure you I'll get on with this. Can I go to the next slide? Okay. But I have not prepared a thorough, comprehensive treatment of what everyone has said. I have selected things that I think are particularly worth commenting on. And Martin said at the start of the discussion, we need evidence to answer our questions. And improve systems that best suit our collective needs. But I think that is already conceding too much, as if there is one common set of needs.
I was being optimistic.
One common set. In fact, let me use that mic, and then I can I'll get away from that one, and then I can pace around and point with my stick. There isn't one set of questions. When a company is trying to market a product, the question they ask is not, is it safe, but can we generate the evidence and data required to get over the regulatory hurdles? If you're in the public health business, you ask an entirely different question, namely, is there any evidence that this product might constitute a hazard or a risk? So there isn't one set of questions. Their questions may not be the same as our questions. Yes, corporate organisations and, for that matter, public-private partnerships don't just want to, it's true, they don't just want a favourable regulatory regime, they do also want subsidies for their R&D. Next slide, please. Okay. And then Martin said, oh, how do you escape lobbyists? Oh, this may be what you might think is a trivial linguistic point about the English language. But let me just explain where that idea of a lobbyist comes from. And it's a sort of parliamentary image that you can imagine in Westminster. The idea is that decisions get made either within the House of Commons or in the minister's office, whereas the lobbyists are outside the location where decisions are made and try to influence it from the outside. But I think that's often the wrong image. Often people who are called lobbyists are on the inside making the decisions, and therefore to call them the lobbyist is already conceding too much. Yes, of course, José Bové is correct that he's not anti-science, but he asked you in which direction science is developing, and I think that's an important way of framing the issue, because science does not move inevitably in one single direction. So the development of knowledge has directionality. People choose to explore some questions and neglect others, and so there's an important question about which direction it goes in and how the agendas are set, which is not a question that can be settled by scientists within science. It is a question of power over and in science, and to pretend otherwise is to miss the point. Yes, he did call for a moratorium on GM technology, but until we know what the impacts are. So he wasn't saying, I'm anti-science. I would interpret him as asking for more and better science as a condition for accepting that particular technology. And of course, for a reallocation of EU research funds. I mean, yeah, people say, oh, look at the productivity of organic ag per hectare or per worker or per unit of capital. It might be low, but then it's had vanishingly slight amounts of, okay, it's not low per unit area, but it is quite low per unit of labour. But it's had vanishingly small amounts of investment in R&D, in levels of investment that I would almost call homeopathic by comparison with the monumental amounts of money that have gone into commercial agriculture. Yeah, so we want transparency, but transparency is not enough. He said we need new ways to assess these scientific debates. Let's go on. Oh yes, Naomi Oreskes highlighted, yes, industrial corporations recruit scientists and I like this, other credible people. So how does that work? Let me give you an answer. Next slide. I found this quote. The source was given on that previous slide, but time is short. What matters is what this quote says. It's just spectacular. I love reading this to my students. Regulatory policy is increasingly made with the partition of experts, especially academics. A regulated firm, oh sorry, now I should explain. The authors of this book are American industrialists. And this is the kind of book that would never be written in Britain, because the Brits are too subtle and delicate. There's wonderful straightforwardness of we're just out to get regulatory capture, and this, folks, is how you do it. A regulatory firm should be prepared, whenever possible, to co-opt these experts. This is the best bit, which is why I've put it in italics. This is most effectively done by identifying the leading experts in each relevant field and hiring them as consultants and advisors, or giving them research grants and the like. This activity requires a modicum of finesse. It must not be too blatant, for the experts themselves must not recognize that they've lost their objectivity and freedom of action. At a minimum, a program of this kind reduces the threat that the leading experts will be available to testify or write against the interest. So it is. So actually, you know, people say to me. So I talk to regulatory scientists who are acting as paid consultants of the companies whose products they're evaluating, and they say, but I don't say what I say because they pay me. To which I reply, no, that may be true, but it's because you say what you say that you are the people they choose to give money to, and you are the people they choose to nominate to go onto those panels. Oh yes, of course Naomi is right. Firms often restrict publication of unfavourable results. How might we deal with this? Well, one rule could be, and this is what the British Medical Association and others are trying to introduce into the medical field. You say that companies can only submit data in support of an application to market a product if the study is registered before it starts with its protocol and intended completion date, and all registered research must subsequently be published at the earliest opportunity. And that would hopefully get over this business of companies doing studies and only releasing the results of the ones that give them results that favour their output. Okay, yes, okay. I will endeavour not to spend too long in the philosophical stratosphere. But I did a physics degree several centuries ago, and while doing that I did succumb to a severe attack of philosophy from which I have almost complete remission of symptoms, but nonetheless I'll try and respond to what I think is a very important challenge from Silvio, which is how to recognize, how to achieve and how to reconcile scientific and democratic legitimacy. Yes, which links to Lizette's question about how much evidence is enough. Next slide, please. Okay. All right. This is my attempt to provide a graphic representation of some of the ways in which the role of science in policy has been conceptualized. And I would argue that certainly until the mid to late 90s, at the European Commission, what I would call a technocratic model was adopted. It was the basis of a narrative legitimating how policy was made, but also was reflected in the institutional structure. And the claim was, well, policy was based on and only on science, and we have the facts, and the facts decide what policy was made. I mean, we heard this most frequently in the United Kingdom in relation to bovine spongiform encephalopathy, mad cow disease, Rinderwahnsinn, La Vache Folle, call it what you will. Margaret Thatcher, I've lost count of the number of times she would stand up in Parliament and say, we are doing what and only what our experts tell us. What she didn't say is, we decided what the policy would be first, and then we chose only those experts that would give us the advice that we've already decided we want to receive. So instead of having evidence-based policy making, we had policy-based evidence selection and expert selection. But after the BSE crisis of '96, which I like to characterise as the worst catastrophe in British public policy between the Suez crisis of '56 and the invasion of Iraq in 2003, we got a new account of science in public policy making, which derives from the US and the 1986, is it?
1980 book.
Yes, a risk assessment in the federal government, right, but known as the Red Book, because it was printed with a red cover. And this was a different model, and I should explain that in these graphs, it's color-coded, which might be evident to those of you who are less colorblind than me, but I'm using blue to symbolize the cool qualities of science, and red for the heat of politics. Okay. So the idea on this model is that, yes, policy making still starts from science, And it gets the facts, and risk assessments are then passed to policymakers, so facts are separate from values, and in the light of the advice from scientists, policymakers, taking into account legitimately non-scientific considerations such as values and interests and practicalities, and also to some extent the uncertainty in the science, then decide what is the right thing to do and then tell the public and industry to do it. But both of those models are seriously misleading. They're both exceedingly popular. I would characterize this model currently as the official orthodoxy of the European Union, the Commission, the European Food Safety Authority, the World Health Organization, the US FDA, and many institutions. But it's seriously misleading because, of course, science does not act in a policy vacuum. There is not just, as I said, there's not just one set of questions, there are multiple questions that can be asked. And therefore, if you'll oblige me with the next slide, I'll offer my alternative model, which, yes, there is, of course, an indispensable role for science in public policy, doing expert assessments informed by scientific evidence, but that expert assessment is always dependent upon prior upstream assumptions about what's the relevant question, what counts as relevant evidence, and how much evidence is sufficient. Could we just go back one slide? Because an important distinction between this model here and the next one is in this model, the arrow only goes in one direction. So it portrays science as influencing policy, but policy never influences science. If we come to this one, in reality, expert assessments are always framed by some prior upstream assumptions, which are essentially risk management assumptions of a political kind, which frame the assessment. I'll give you a couple of examples, if I've got time. In the European Union, let's do it the other way. Let's do the US first. When the US considers the environmental impact of genetically modified crops, the question they ask is, does the cultivation of these GM crops cause cause changes to the environment that would adversely affect the finances and economics of US farmers? Otherwise, it's not an adverse effect, it's an adaptation. In Europe, that was not considered as an adequate question, first, because, of course, our agricultural and non-agricultural environments are much more closely integrated, and so the question was initially, in the mid-90s, would the cultivation of these crops cause significant changes to flora and fauna in the environment? Well, initially they only asked about direct short-term changes, and then Parliament pushed them into looking at long-term and indirect changes. And so, which question gets asked, what evidence gets incorporated, is influenced by these prior framing assumptions. And very interestingly, for reasons that I struggle to understand, the Codex Alimentarius Commission, back in 2003, started to recognize this. They introduced this term, risk assessment policy, and they said risk assessment policy, as it were, prior to any risk assessment taking place, risk managers should specify the risk assessment policy to the risk assessors, making clear what the question should be, what the evidence should be, and what the criteria of interpretation are. But curiously, Codex is not implementing its own guidance. And even more remarkably, the guidance that Codex agreed to for itself in 2003 was then agreed to by all member states of Codex in 2007, and that's supposed to apply to all member states of the EU and, of course, to the European Commission, which is a member of Codex. Curiously, none of them were implementing this guidance. But my claim is that in practice? Well, you've got multiple contested ways of framing risk assessment, and risk assessments are, as it were, sandwiched between some upstream political judgments and some downstream political judgments, for instance, about trade-offs between costs and benefits and so on. And if you take a model like this and implement it properly, I would contend that it provides the means to answer the question that Silvio asked about the conditions under which you can reconcile scientific and democratic legitimacy. And if you would move on to the next slide, that would be grateful. Oh yes. So moving on rapidly. Oh yes, I think what Sylvain was talking about, I think, was what could be called technocratic internationalism. And of course, when you have multiple member states coming together, each with different policy agendas, and you can't resolve those, you can't readily reach a political consensus, the way to do it is, well, tell you what, let's give it to the scientists and lock them in a room until they agree, and then we'll call that, as it were, the scientific solution to the policy problem. And he's explained its origins, but I don't think, I'm not so sure he's explained its persistence and resilience. But yeah, sorry. You might be familiar with the term NGOs, non-governmental organisations. I think it's worth differentiating between different kinds of NGOs. So for me, a bingo is a business interest NGO, and public interest NGOs are pingos. So we should differentiate pingos and bingos. In Britain it's complicated because we also have gongos, which are government-organised, non-governmental organisations. That's beside the point. But what I'm saying is, this kind of technocratic narrative is both very appealing to bingos. So, I mean, ILSI, the International Life Science Institute, is a classic business interest NGO, but it also is useful to the commissioners and the commission staff because it enables them to portray their policy judgments as if they were socially, economically, politically neutral and purely objective and uncontestable. Next slide. Okay. Oh yeah. Let's skip that one. Life's short. We need something to eat and drink. Oh yes. These prior upstream policy judgments that frame risk assessments, they're important, they're always present, they're rarely acknowledged, they're often decided by people called risk assessors, so policy judgments masquerade as if they were scientific, but they're of at least three kinds. They're, as I say, they're substantive, procedural, interpretive. So substantive, yes, what counts as a risk? Oh yeah, I gave you the GM example. Let me give you another one, another food one. Emulsifiers are a category of food additive. They're regulated under EU law by Commission on the basis of the advice from the European Food Safety Authority. And when they're assessed, they have always and only been assessed in purely toxicological terms. The question that gets asked is, are they toxic? That's a legitimate question, but that's not the entire issue. They may have other important impacts on public health. We all know that one of the most important diet-related considerations in public health is overweight and obesity. And if you track the increase in obesity in Europe and compare it to the content of the diet, nutrient content of the diet, it's quite clear that the reason that obesity has been closely correlated and almost certainly causally connected to rises in the oil and fat content of the diet. And what enables oil and fats to be present in the diet in cakes, biscuits, chocolate, ice cream, dessert products, pizzas, and so on and so forth? Emulsifiers. Emulsifiers keep these oils and fats in suspension and contribute substantially to adverse effects on public health. But this is entirely absent from the agenda. It's not on EFSA's agenda. The only people EFSA ask about emulsifiers are toxicologists. And they tend to say, well, they're safe. Actually, lecithin is probably not toxicologically problematic, but I think it may well be problematic in public health terms. But that's not part of the substantive risk assessment policy. They asked toxicologists about it, and curiously enough, toxicologists narrowly focus on toxicological considerations and are completely blind to public health nutritional considerations. So what counts as risk and what counts as relevant evidence? Yeah. You feed emulsifiers to rats, rats don't get fat if you just feed them the emulsifiers, but you feed them ready-made pizzas and watch them swell. Okay, then you have other assumptions about how to conduct a risk assessment. Is it open or closed? Now, one of the good things that came out of the Food Standards Agency in Britain, and it's not often that I applaud what they do, but they, since 2003, have made it a rule that all their expert advisory committees meet in public. They are open. Now, EFSA, to its credit, is talking about increasing transparency of risk assessment. However, I have heard repeated remarks from members of expert advisory committees in EFSA saying, oh, we couldn't possibly meet in public. You know, we couldn't be expected to be frank if people were listening. Well, I'm sorry, that's just ridiculous. If they want to be trusted, they're going to have to learn to live with proper transparency. And they've got to be open, not opaque, and to be accountable. It's very interesting, though, when Food Standards Agency panels started to be open, I would go to a few meetings. Life's too short to go to all of them. But there was a stunning occasion at which the Committee on Toxicity in London was talking about the possible evidence of possible carcinogenicity of a pesticide, when a member of the Committee on Toxicity, who had at the start of the meeting declared that he had a conflict of interest to the extent that he was a paid consultant to a chemical industry trade association, and he said, when there was evidence of possible carcinogenicity, he said, we, the committee, we have a special responsibility to avoid a false positive. I was the only person in the room who blinked at that. You know, I thought the Committee on Toxicity was there to protect public health, not to bend over backwards to think of reasons to discount evidence of toxicity in favour of the industry. And and the rule was the meetings were in public, but the public may not speak until after all decisions have been taken. So at the end of the meeting I said, excuse me, but I was slightly puzzled by that, and none of you seem to think that that was a non-scientific policy judgment about the interpretation of science, and precisely the opposite of what you should be doing. They all looked quite shocked. You know, but we're scientists, as if nothing but scientific comments could come out of their mouths. You know. So there are important questions about procedure, but also about interpretation. Yes. I mean, we've got a situation, even at EFSA, even at the World Health Organization, where evidence from animal studies are treated as entirely reliable when they don't show harm, and completely unreliable when they do suggest harm. I'm sorry, if you're going to do the studies on mice and rats, at least interpret them consistently. I mean, sometimes it gets really dreadful. EFSA sometimes said, in an EFSA panel, they'll say, oh, well, there was this study, but there was no statistically significant evidence of an adverse effect. I'm sorry, there were only 6 rats per dose group. And if the standard requirement for statistical significance is less than 1 chance in 20 that it was a random artifact, that means 5 out of 6 could have dropped dead, and it wouldn't have counted as statistically significant. So if that isn't a false negative, I don't know what is. Yeah, next, okay. Oh yeah, well, next. Done that. That's it, okay. So, I have not simply summed up what was said, but I have followed Martin's invitation to provide a commentary on what was said. I will, and I've also been asked by Martin but start tomorrow morning with the summary of today, and then summarise again at the end. I will try not to repeat myself, but because there will be quite a few members of the European Parliament present tomorrow who aren't here today, if you don't mind, I will take the liberty of reading out that quote from Brottingham and whatever the name is, on how regulatory capture works. Thank you. Let's have something to do.
Thank you everyone for your patience. You're very welcome to have food and drinks with us upstairs.
C'est quand même marrant qu'on a le même processeur, exactement le même processeur.
Mais pas le même, pas le même système d'exposition.
Non, j'avais mis sur Ubuntu chez moi, ça va tourner quoi.
Ouais, après il faut voir. Oui, c'est vrai. Après il faut voir aussi. Moi c'est un SSD aussi. Il n'y a pas que le processeur. C'est un flash aussi.
Ah,
mais le système d'exploitation il est sur un disque dur qui est genre 15 fois plus rapide que le disque dur.
Moi c'est vrai que c'est un SATA.
Ouais.
Ah oui, c'est un SSD.
T'as deux quoi.